First, just in Slovenian, briefly, pozdravljeni na našem novem tedenskem pomenku večjezičnosti. And good evening and welcome at this week's weekly discussion on multilingualism. Our today's guest is Dr. Lindo Fisher, who will speak to us about multilingual identity and why it matters. Dr. Fisher is Professor of Languages Education at the Faculty of Education in Cambridge, so at the University of Cambridge. And her research areas include multilingualism, multilingual identity, creativity in language learning, metaphor in relation to belief schemata, second language teacher education, motivation, and the academic and social integration of English as an additional language learners. In addition to her work related to the university, she also works extensively with secondary age language learners and their teachers, and is co-investigator in two different projects related to multilingualism. So the first one is called Multilingualism, Empowering Individuals, Transforming Societies. This strand investigates participative identity construction in the language learning classroom. And the second project is called Creative Multilingualism, and as the name suggests, investigates creativity in the languages classroom. So we're very excited, Dr. Fisher, to have you with us. Thank you again for agreeing to participate in our discussions. If there's something that I maybe forgot to mention, I'll ask you to complete the description. And so without further ado, thank you again, and the screen is yours.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Tina, and to both Tinas, and thank you for your invitation today to talk to you. I'm very excited to do it. I'm going to share my screen and hope that everyone can see what we're doing. How does that look? Does that look okay? Lovely.
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you so much. Great. So as I say, it's great to be here talking about multilingualism with teachers, two of my favorite things. I love educating teachers and discussing teaching and teaching practice, and I'm very interested in multilingualism. So today I would like to talk to you about, let me just get my slide move forward. What is multilingual identity and why does it matter? So today we're thinking about who talks about themselves as being multilingual. Is it a good thing? How can we talk about that with people in our classrooms, with our learners? And what benefits might that bring? And then I'm going to show a little bit later how people can actually do that in a more practical way, perhaps. So the research that I'm going to draw on, as Tina said, is part of a project that I've been involved in, and you might see the logo up at the top there, Multilingualism, Empowering Individuals, Transforming Societies was the title of the big project. And we were one team within this big project, and this is my team at Cambridge, and we've all been working on this together. It's very much a joint effort that I'm presenting today on our work. And we are also been part, as I say, of this big group, and that had loads and loads of researchers, 34 researchers across different universities in the UK. And then we also had these international partners also working with us. So for example, colleagues in Bergen were doing we planned some simultaneous research with them. They did it in their context, we did it in the UK context, and had a look at the joint sort of findings and so forth. So big project, lots of different sorts of people. We had people working in literature and cinema. We had people working in the history of ideas, people working in cognition, and we were situated in the middle there in education. So we were thinking about school education, in fact. And the overarching aims of the big project were basically to think about multilingualism in the round, the opportunities, the challenges, the relationship between diversity, identity, and so forth, people in societies and so on. And to think about how we can influence attitudes towards multilingualism and re-energize research in this area. So if you're interested in anything to do with maybe the overarching project, please do visit the website. It's mites.org, and you'll see a lot more about that project and about the other strands and so on. So on to today, what we're going to think about is the things that we were looking at, which was how we theorize multilingual identity in the school context, how we work out what it is. Thinking about the link between multilingualism, and the extent to which you identify, and how that links then to learning in school. And we're going to think about that in terms of attainment as well, and some research we did, which tried to sort of see if there was a link between how you identify as multilingual and how well you do in school. We're going to see a little bit, well, we were looking a little bit about how it's developed through learning a language and in the languages classroom, and then whether we can actually innovate in the classroom to think about multilingual identity in order to keep people motivated and bring other benefits, such as maybe better cohesion in the classroom and maybe beyond in society, which again we'll come back to later on. So today we're going to think about, first of all, what is identity? It's sort of quite a hot topic, isn't it? People talk about identity a lot these days, and maybe they always have, but it seems especially so at the moment. We're going to think about what it is. We're going to think about what is a multilingual identity. We're going to think about why we should focus on multilingual identity. And we're going to think about how we can help learners to identify so as to maintain languages they have in their profiles and maybe invest in learning other languages as well, or the languages they're currently learning. So what is the identity of identity? So what is actually identity at all? So there are lots of different perspectives on it. So we have sort of psychological perspectives or social psychological perspectives on identity. And of course, the most famous person who wrote about this is Erickson. If you wanted to read a little bit more, he would be a good person to go to. A sort of founding father, if you like, of psychological perspectives on it. And essentially, he said that it's a multidimensional psychosocial developmental process, and you've got individual and social factors which influence your identity. And this develops over time. So we've got a link to our past identities, our future identities, and the identities we have at the moment. And so identity shift is possible in some sense. Then we've got people like Vygotsky, who had a sort of social perspective on it, not necessarily talking particularly about identity, but essentially thinking about how individual mental functioning can be understood personally and through thinking about social, historical, and cultural processes. So our identity formation is mediated by social contexts and by the interactions we have. So that is to do with how we relate to people, where we're placed, and so forth. So in this perspective, identities tend to be considered as multiple and provisional. So you identify in a certain way at a particular time in a particular context, but that can also shift according to different contexts and so on. And then we have a post-structural view of identity, which quite quickly means that this is how you think again, same things coming in, it's about time, it's about space, it's about how you might identify differently across those two things. And the most famous scholar on this field is Bonnie Norton, and she would say that there is no real core identity, but it's always shifting and dynamic, and that self-transformation is possible. So you've got lots of people working in identity theoretically, if you like, and you could sort of put it all together if you tried to think about what they all bring to the picture about what identity is. But what they do tend to agree on is that identity is both individual and a social phenomenon, that it is a process rather than a fixed condition. And so therefore we can change our identities and the way we identify. Obviously, there are things that stop that from happening in our society and so forth, because you can't just identify as anything at all, can you? I mean, there are some constraints on that, I suppose, societally, but essentially we have got some agency in shifting our identities. And when we start to think of it in that way, we can see that actually maybe teachers do play a role in constructing identities, don't we? In the classroom, we project our own identities, but we also help others construct their identities as learners, as linguists, and so forth. So there's a lot there that we can think about, I think, in our practice. And so language is obviously very core in identity construction, because how we talk, the way we talk, the things we say, they really are an identity act, aren't they? We are acting our identities out when we use language, So when we use one of our languages, we may be identifying in a certain way and might be identified by other people in a certain way. And when we use a different language, that might shift slightly also, mightn't it? So essentially, we could summarize some of what we've been saying by thinking about what a linguistic identity is. So a linguistic identity might refer to the way one identifies or is identified by others in each of the languages in your linguistic repertoire. So we've all got a linguistic repertoire of maybe 1 or 2 or 3 named languages, standard languages, if you like. And we would have an identity in each of those. But much of the research and much of the thinking has been very much about our identification in each of our languages. But of course, we've had this multilingual shift recently, haven't we? Where we're thinking about people as multilinguals, going sort of almost beyond named single languages, sort of thinking about this multilingual self or a multilingual identity. And we've had this sort of shift, this sort of turn, which maybe makes us think that we actually have to think, rather than having an identity in each of our languages, do I have a multilingual identity? Do I conceive of myself as a multilingual person? Do others conceive of me as a multilingual person? What is there in society which either helps me to identify in that way or which constrains my identification in some senses? So it may well be that we actually need to develop some identity competence in students, and perhaps we need to develop some multilingual identity competence in students. So what could we mean by multilingual? Because lots of people have got different views about when you can use the label multilingual to refer to yourself or to refer to others. Some people say it's about proficiency. You have to be really, almost balanced in the languages that you speak in order to say that you're multilingual. Others make it about number. You've got to have more than 3 or whatever. But in our team, and in line with some other scholars like Jan Blomert and so forth, we are going along the lines of that. We've got an all-encompassing view of multilingualism. And what we think is that multilingual identity is more concerned with your relationship to your linguistic repertoire than it is with the exact constitution of the repertoire, although the two may correlate. And what we mean by that is that if we were, as researchers, to identify the participants that we were working with in schools, i.e. all of the school children that we were working with, we would actually ascribe everyone the term multilingual. And I'm going to come on and explain why that might be just now. So we see it as individuals' understandings of themselves in the widest sense. So it's like an umbrella identity that encompasses but transcends all the specific identities that someone might have in their portfolio of languages. And within that, we actually include a full range of communicative repertoire. So that means that we would see someone who could sign as having that in the repertoire, someone who could code using other communicative resources like that. Someone, we make it quite fun with students and say someone who can read emoji has got another way of understanding and communicating. So we're thinking of it very, very widely, in a very wide sense, rather than named languages at a certain level of proficiency. So let's move on to this next bit here. And we've discussed some of this, if you're interested, in some of our papers about how we conceive it and why we think it's important. And that's one of the papers there. So why focus on multilingual identity in a school context? What are the reasons for focusing on multilingual identity? Well, we think it's important for a number of reasons, and here is a quick run through some of them. We all go through life and our languages shift slightly, don't we? At certain points, we feel very proficient in a particular language. At other points, we don't. There's some sort of attrition. If I think of myself always in terms of that one language, that will shift a lot. But if I think about my multilingual repertoire, I can think that actually, of course, there's going to be movement within this, but that identity stays the same. I am multilingual because I have all of these things in the repertoire. Some of them are going up, some of them are going down, some of them are going all over the place, but I can still be multilingual. So this is quite good, I think, for younger learners to think about that, because, you know, thinking about things that I have had in the past and I don't have anymore, well, you can rekindle that, you can work on it. Maybe you'll pick this language up again in the future. Also, people can be proud of all the languages in their repertoires. Now, we know that some languages are marginalized, minoritized, not very valued. And once you start to think of yourself as a multilingual person, all of those languages almost come into sort of equal status, don't they? Then you've just got all of these, but they're not prioritized. So I can value those and I can talk about them with some pride. It might remove the hang-ups regarding proficiency that we talked about before. And I might actually invest now in learning some more language, or in the future when I may come back to it. It may well be that also we can develop better empathy and better intercultural understanding, because we can think about linguistic resources in our communities and actually start to value them. And that could lead possibly to better social cohesion, both within schools and within societies. We might get better language awareness if we start to think about all the things we can do in our repertoires as well, and that could help us with our literacy and our oracy. And we may actually even achieve better in our learning more generally, and we'll come on to that in a second as well, because we've actually got some evidence that that's true. So now we're going to come on to think about how you can actually research this, because it's all very well saying all of these things and saying that this sounds lovely and we can all be multilingual and so forth, but how do you even research that? How do we know that it has any benefits and so on? So how did we do it? So what we did was we went into 7 schools in England, and we chose some schools in big cities and some schools in more rural locations. And we worked with children of about 12 to 14 years old, and then we looked at another cohort of 14 to 16-year-olds, and we looked over a sort of 2-year period and dealt with quite a number of students in the research. And we set them questionnaires, and we also did some qualitative data where we would ask, did interviews and so forth, and ask them other sort of metaphorical questions and so forth to develop different understandings of their beliefs and their attitudes and so forth. And we took a lot of demographic data where we looked at people's languages and we looked at their social economic status and so forth, and tried to build all of that in. You'll see a little acronym on the page which says EAL, and that means English as an additional language. And that would be learners in schools in the UK who are believed to speak a language other than English in the home context. Okay, so how did we then go about some of these other things? And as you see there, we asked all the children in the surveys which languages they knew and how they used it and so forth, to get a lot of their experience of using language at home. We asked them whether they thought they were EAL, whether they were English as an additional language students, whether they used the language at home, and how they used their languages. So they were to tell us those things. We asked them to tell us whether they thought they were monolinguals or multilinguals by putting them a little X on a scale. And we asked other questions about what they thought their teachers understood by language learning, and themselves as language learners, friends and teachers, and built all that into our data gathering. And we asked them about their emotions, pride in languages and language learning, etc., etc. Okay, so this is how we conceptualized it, that it would be made up from experiences with languages, how I evaluate languages, my beliefs about languages, my beliefs about myself in relation to languages, and other people's beliefs about languages and language learning. And then also linked to that emotion, because we know there's a lot of emotion tied up with self-beliefs and a lot of emotion tied up with language as well. Okay, and if you wanted, again, we've got another couple of papers there where you can read some of the findings from the work that we did, but I'm going to run through quite quickly now with you a few of the findings before showing you some of the materials that we used. Okay, so the first interesting finding from here is to have a look and see how people tell us if they're multilingual or not, because it's quite interesting to read about whether the school told us that some children were English as an additional language learners, whether people themselves told us that, and whether people actually explained themselves to be multilingual or not as well. So let's have a look and see what they said. So what we did was we had a look at the school recorded EAL data, the self-identification as EAL learners, and self-identification as multilingual, just to see what the links between those might be. So we did that, and then we compared it to the sorts of outcomes that students were getting at their age 16 examinations. And interestingly, what we found was, but for the students that the school had recorded them as EAL, then only Spanish showed an improvement at the GCSE, that's the examination level. So all the other subjects, there was nothing coming up as different between the groups, EAL and non-EAL. However, for those students who said, yes, I am EAL, by telling us all the languages they spoke, as including at home, then modern languages and science showed a significant improvement for those children. We don't quite know why, but this is what we found. But very interestingly, if a student, whether they were EAL or not, or whether they identified as EAL or not, identified as multilingual, i.e. put their arrow, their X rather, towards the multilingual end of the scale, then there was a significant improvement in all of their examination results, except for English language and history. So what we see is it's a really interesting finding that whether you're multilingual or not, the children who told us that they were multilingual, whether they had spoken lots of languages at home or not, or whether they were just learning a foreign language in school and had no other official languages in their profile, those were the children who did best in exams at the end. So it's an incredibly sort of interesting finding to us. And what really we can say is when it comes to multilingualism, what you think you are might be more important than what others say you are. So we can say, yes, you're multilingual and you're not, and so forth. But if the children think they're multilingual, they did better in exams. Now, it's really hard for us to understand why that is. It might be something to do with a mindset, like a growth mindset, being willing to claim that label, regardless of the proficiency levels that you've got. So therefore you're a more ambitious learner or whatever. We're not quite sure. But basically, it would seem that what you think about yourself and the emotions attached to it are really important in helping students to do better in exams. And therefore, it's probably helpful if we can try to encourage as many learners as possible to identify as multilingual. So we decided to do an intervention in classrooms to try to see if we can work with students about multilingualism and help them to think about multilingualism and help them to think about themselves as multilinguals. So we had these 3 dimensions there, we can see at the bottom. We gave them knowledge about multilingualism. So we built up lessons for teachers to teach in school, and the teachers taught them. We produced PowerPoints and resources, and they helped the teachers to talk to students about multilingualism, and I'll show you some examples in a moment. We also then got more awareness in the class about the levels of multilingualism in the school, in the local society, in classroom, and so forth. And then we also, reflexivity, got people to think about all of the ideas that they heard in relation to themselves and what it means for me. And then we measured it all. And this was our model, which you don't need to spend a lot of time on now. That's our sort of theorized model. If you give them information, let them process it and so forth, that could lead to some sort of change. So these are the materials are here. If you want to go and get these materials, they're in English, but they can be translated or whatever, and they're freely available to be downloaded, and that's the site. And we've got resources for languages teachers, we've got resources for primary teachers, and we've got resources for the whole school for helping people to think about multilingualism and their multilingual identities. And now I'm going to show you some of the resources. So these are the sessions, 8 sessions that we have with PowerPoints, teachers' notes, and worksheets. And there are lots of key messages that we wanted to get across in the lessons, and those are provided for the teachers. So just raising students' awareness, for example, of different ways in which a person can be multilingual, helping them to reflect on the different ways we use language in our communities and so forth. Those are the ideas behind the teaching materials. And then we got, first of all, people to think about, what does it mean to be multilingual? Can you use computer code? Can you communicate through non-verbal signs? Can you read books in another language? Do you speak a dialect? And that was quite an interesting thing for the learners to think about, that dialect could be something that could be part of a repertoire. So we got them to think about that. We got them to think about the other ways in which multilingualism can be beneficial and so forth, and the ways in which they can communicate. We got them to think in the classroom together about what it means to be monolingual and multilingual, and got them to do exercises where they put themselves on the scale, got up and moved around the classroom and so forth in imaginary scales. We gave them information, knowledge about multilingualism, where languages connect, where they come from, and so on. We talked to them about the dialects by having a look at the UK and the different dialects spoken, and asking them to reflect on whether they've got a dialect or whatever. We got them to think about accents and what an accent means, what accent they might have in their home languages, what they have in the language they're learning in school, whether it matters, what it says about someone, and so on. And they found that, again, very interesting. We got them to think about how their thinking has shifted. What did I think before? How has that shifted? Because that reflexivity was turning out to be very, very important. And those are the resources from the classroom. So as I said, we gave some people knowledge about multilingualism, some people knowledge about multilingualism plus much more reflexivity on what it means for them, and then some classes just got a normal lesson so that we could see what the difference might be. So this is all written up again in a paper. You can see the results, but I'll take you to the key, I think, findings of it just now. And that was that basically pride in the classrooms where we talked about multilingualism and we raised awareness about multilingualism, the scores for pride in languages showed a significant increase. So once we started to think about how we can value languages in the curriculum, the languages that we speak, the languages that we learn in school, people started to feel proud. So we saw a lot of shifting in their ways in which they would say they were proud of the languages that they had in their repertoires. And so we saw that basically if they were reflecting on identity, then their emotions towards languages and language learning shifted. And people also then in these groups were much more likely to push their X towards the multilingual end of the scale, i.e. they reconsidered and thought, yes, okay, I probably could say I'm multilingual. So we had one learner, and she was one who actually did rather well, because she said, you know, yes, I've got French in my repertoire. She had no other languages. It was just that she was learning in French. And she said, so yes, I think that would make me multilingual because I can speak French, I can speak English and so forth. So she was really open to embracing this multilingual identity. I mean, I must say it wasn't quite so straightforward. We had other people who did have a number of languages who still were hesitant about saying they were multilingual. And you know, that again is coming from who knows what, but there's a lot of, I suppose, thinking about what other people think I'm allowed to say involved, but we definitely saw a shift in people's conceptions. And we weren't saying you had to say you were multilingual at the end. They were allowed to say exactly what they wanted. It was, you know, it was anonymously shared with us. And, you know, it's up to you how you identify, but there's no way that we tried to, we believe it's a value, obviously, but we weren't going to you know, insist that people change their that's up to them how they identify. So anyway, on to evaluation. How do I evaluate languages? What are my beliefs about languages? So the findings here were that people in the intervention groups, they were positively influenced by their understanding of languages and their importance, etc., than the students in the control group. So once they'd heard more about languages, much more about multilingualism, they were much more likely to value languages. So it suggests that knowledge about languages may increase the extent to which they value them. So maybe we should be talking to students about language and the importance of language where they don't feel it's valuable. Maybe in your context, it's already in place. However, it was only the full intervention group pupils who were significantly more likely to identify as multilingual following the intervention. So I think it is also important to know about language and to reflect on its importance and what it can benefits it can bring for you and society and all the rest of it, and multilingualism. But you do also have to think about it for yourself if you're going to shift your identity. You have to do the exercises which make you think about, what does this mean for me? What does it mean for my life and my situation, rather than just hearing it without, I suppose, that personal engagement, maybe without the emotional dimension to it. To shift identity, I think you need that. Let's have a look at some of the things that people were telling us afterwards in interviews and in written pieces. So this is a non-EAL student who said, I didn't really think about it before. Lots of my friends have different backgrounds from speaking different languages, being multilingual, but I didn't think about that for myself. But I do think now that that's me being that. So it's definitely changed my opinion of it. So basically this person is prepared to claim a multilingual identity after intervention. Beforehand, this person thought that it was okay for other people to claim that identity because they spoke some other languages, but it's not something that I could claim for myself. But afterwards they thought, oh, okay, I could claim this for myself if we have this broad conceptualization and if I think about what it could mean for me. And we're going to do a few more quotations. Pride. What does it mean to be multilingual? I don't know, but it feels good because it feels nice to know more than one language. It's like I feel blessed because others don't know more than one language, and they feel pride in it. So it became a sort of way in the classrooms of some children who may have actually hidden their multilingualism a little bit because of the context, actually starting to feel pride and talking about the languages that they had in their repertoires. And we did find that a couple of times. Someone writing, the first time we asked this question, when I speak in a foreign language, they wrote, I feel like a different person because it's not my first language. So they were writing about how they felt rather alienated. But the second time we asked it, they said, I feel like a special person because you feel proud of speaking another language. So we can hear this, they're bringing the word proud into it. This was all open-ended, but they brought it in. They felt like a special person. So they'd started to conceive it differently, not a different person, fine, like a different person, but that's an alienating thing. I don't feel like I'm me. Now I feel special, now I feel proud. And it's a much more positive framing of it. And then it's about giving people the space to think about it. This is a very long quotation, but I think that if you have a look at it now, I'll stop talking and let you read for a second. So this person was valuing the idea of actually stopping and thinking about language rather than doing language, because we do a lot of language in languages classrooms, but actually stopping back and thinking, oh, why is this language like it is? What are the roots of it? What are the links to it? What does it mean for me? Where am I in my journey in learning it? What does it mean to be multilingual, monolingual, and so on? That space for reflection was found to be very interesting. They really, really enjoyed it. and B, actually getting them to maybe change their thinking a little bit. We had quite a lot of information, of quotations a little bit like this. And then the thing about understanding other people, that idea about, you know, social cohesion and so forth a little bit. And the first quotation is about thinking about being a valued member of society, because you can know more about other people and their backgrounds. So they were actually starting to think about the value of learning languages. You know, it opens a gateway to other people. And again, that's that thinking about what's the point. And I know we do sometimes say that, but getting children to reflect on what it means for them personally, rather than us telling us, oh, languages are important and it gives you a gateway and an understanding of other people, making them think about that more deeply for themselves. And thinking about diversity, you know, another question, you know, they thought their own school was special and diverse, but actually it got them to think about diversity more generally and in the round. And then feeling accepted. So this student talked about, an EAL student talked about at the beginning, when she felt a bit weird talking about her languages when she filled it out, when she did the questionnaire at the beginning and so on, when she talked in the class to other people about language and so on. And she said, you know, she worried about people thinking that she's a bit weird because she can talk that language. But then once they'd had all of the discussions and so forth, she felt that everyone knew I spoke a different language and they wouldn't push me away and they were happy with me speaking another language. And so she, you know, that was part of her identity. She feels part of another language and she was actually able to share it and to feel accepted by her classmates. So we do think that on the back of what we've been doing, we're quite excited about it, because we do think that actually doing the bit that we've got on the left-hand side there, this participative multilingual identity education, i.e. getting people involved in thinking, participating in thinking about their identity and about multilingualism, can have some really good benefits. It would seem that there might be some benefits for attainment, which was rather surprising to us, but there also can be benefits from the point of view of feeling good about the languages you speak and being prepared to think more widely about where you speak languages, how you use language, and your communicative repertoire more generally. So our final conclusions. We think it's multilingual identity is shaped by a combination of our experiences, contextual, where we are now and have been in the past, our evaluations, what we think about it ourselves and how we think other people consider it and construe us, and our emotions. And we do see this evidence of a link between identifying and attainment across some school subjects. And therefore, and also that helping multilingual identity helps develop pride and positive emotion towards languages. And identity work in the classroom can remove some barriers, as we saw from some of the quotations. But we need to be explicit. We need to have explicit engagement in the classroom with this education, because these things don't necessarily happen by themselves. We have to get people thinking more about it and guiding them as teachers to think a little bit more about it. So I think I'm going to finish there and say thank you and vielen Dank, and I'm going to hope you tell me in Slovenian how to say that also. I'm going to stop sharing and go back and see if anyone's got any questions or comments.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Fisher, for a very